The security guard's hand pressed against Marcus's chest like he was some kind of criminal, while the hotel manager stood behind him with that look. You know the one. Like Marcus didn't belong in a place with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. What they didn't know was that the man they were blocking from entering the conference room was about to close the biggest deal in their company's history. Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below. My name is Maya Richardson, and I've spent the last 15 years climbing the corporate ladder in America as a black woman. At 35, I thought I'd seen every form of workplace discrimination there was, the subtle exclusions from golf outings, the way ideas got credited to male colleagues, the assumption that I was someone's assistant rather than the director of business development. But nothing prepared me for what I witnessed that Tuesday morning at the Grand Meridian Hotel in downtown Chicago. I was there as Marcus Thompson's business partner and the head of legal affairs for Thompson Industries. Marcus had built his company from the ground up, started in his garage 12 years ago in Southside Chicago, worked 16-hour days while his wife Denise juggled 2 jobs to keep their family afloat, missed countless family dinners and school plays, and sacrificed everything to create what was now a multi-million-dollar enterprise specializing in sustainable technology solutions. The journey hadn't been easy for either of us. I remember the early days when Marcus would call me at midnight, stressed about payroll, wondering if he'd made the right decision leaving his stable engineering job at Boeing to pursue his dream. I was fresh out of Harvard Law then, working at a prestigious firm downtown, but something about Marcus's vision spoke to me. Maybe it was the way he talked about creating jobs in underserved communities, or how he insisted on hiring locally even when it would have been cheaper to outsource. Whatever it was, I knew I wanted to be part of what he was building. That decision cost me. My law firm wasn't thrilled about me taking on outside counsel work, especially for a startup run by a young black man with big dreams and limited capital. I remember my supervising partner, Richard Blackstone, yes, that was really his name, pulling me aside and suggesting I reconsider my charity work. He couldn't understand why I'd risk my career trajectory for what he called a pipe dream in the ghetto. But I believed in Marcus, and more importantly, I believed in what Thompson Industries represented. Here was a black man creating something from nothing, building a company that would eventually employ over 300 people, most of them from communities that had been systematically excluded from the tech boom. Every contract I reviewed, every negotiation I handled, every legal hurdle we cleared together felt like we were proving something important about what was possible when talent met opportunity. By the time we reached this Tuesday morning in November, Thompson Industries had become one of the fastest-growing minority-owned businesses in the Midwest. We'd developed revolutionary solar panel technology that was 30% more efficient than anything else on the market. Our manufacturing facility on the south side had become a source of pride for the community, good-paying jobs that didn't require college degrees, apprenticeship programs that trained young people for careers in renewable energy, partnerships with local schools to promote STEM education. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were meeting at one of the most prestigious hotels in the city. Marcus had chosen the Grand Meridian specifically because David Hartwell, the CEO of Hartwell Corporation, expected a certain image, a certain level of sophistication. Hartwell Corporation was a Fortune 500 company with interests in renewable energy, and they'd been pursuing Marcus for months, wanting to acquire Thompson Industries as part of their expansion into sustainable technology. Marcus had worn his best suit that morning, a navy blue Tom Ford that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to perfection by his teenage son Miguel the night before, a family tradition that had started when Miguel was 8 and wanted to help Daddy look important for his meetings. His briefcase contained contracts that represented years of negotiation, market research, and strategic planning. The deal we were about to close would not only secure the future of Thompson Industries but also provide the capital needed to expand our manufacturing operations and create hundreds of additional jobs. But as I watched him approach the hotel's conference room that morning, I realized that none of that mattered. Not the suit, not the success, not the millions in the bank, not the community he'd lifted up or the families he'd supported. What mattered to the people blocking his path was the color of his skin, and how that color was perceived by individuals who had never bothered to look beyond it. The Grand Meridian Hotel prided itself on serving Chicago's business elite. The lobby featured marble imported from Italy, crystal chandeliers from Prague, and artwork that cost more than most people's houses. The staff wore uniforms designed by the same company that outfitted employees at five-star hotels in Paris and London. Everything about the place screamed exclusivity, sophistication, and wealth. I had arrived early, as was my habit before important meetings. I wanted to review the contracts one final time, ensuring that every detail was perfect. The conference room they'd reserved for us was spectacular, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, a mahogany table that could seat 20 people, and technology that would allow us to connect with Hartwell's board members in New York and Los Angeles. The Hartwell Corporation team had arrived shortly after me. David Hartwell himself was there, along with his chief financial officer, head of acquisitions, and 2 lawyers from their New York headquarters. They were exactly what you'd expect from a Fortune 500 company, confident, well-dressed, and comfortable in spaces like this. They belonged here in a way that didn't require explanation or justification. As we made small talk while waiting for Marcus, I couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought us to this moment. 2 years earlier, Hartwell Corporation had approached us about a potential partnership. At first, they'd seemed primarily interested in our technology, the solar panels that could generate more power with less surface area, the battery storage systems that could hold energy longer than anything else on the market. But as the negotiations progressed, I began to suspect there was more to their interest. Hartwell Corporation was facing pressure from shareholders and regulators to increase diversity in their supply chain and leadership. Acquiring Thomson Industries wouldn't just give them access to revolutionary technology, it would also allow them to check several boxes on their corporate social responsibility reports. Marcus and I had discussed this extensively, and while we weren't naive about their motivations, we also recognized the opportunity it represented. The acquisition would provide Thomson Industries with the resources to scale up production, expand into new markets, and continue our mission of creating economic opportunity in underserved communities. More importantly, it would demonstrate that Black-owned businesses could compete at the highest levels of American industry. Success at this scale would open doors for other minority entrepreneurs, proving that excellence knows no color. I was already seated in the conference room, reviewing the final contract details with the Hartwell team, when I heard the commotion outside. Through the glass doors, I could see Marcus standing in the hallway, his path blocked by a security guard who looked like he bench-pressed small cars for fun. The guard was a massive man, easily 6'4" and 250 pounds, with the kind of build that suggested military or law enforcement background. His stance was aggressive, legs slightly apart, one hand resting on his radio, the other held up in a stopping motion toward Marcus. Behind the guard stood James Morrison, the hotel's general manager, a thin, pale man in his 50s who carried himself with the kind of arrogance that comes from never having to prove himself to anyone. Morrison had the look of someone who'd inherited his position rather than earned it, all designer clothes and perfect hair but lacking the confidence that comes from actual achievement. His expression was a mixture of annoyance and superiority, like Marcus's presence was personally offensive to him. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification," the security guard was saying, his voice carrying that practiced authority that comes from years of telling people what they can and cannot do. His tone was professional but cold, the kind of voice you use when you've already decided someone is a problem. Marcus remained calm, his voice steady and measured. "I'm here for a business meeting in Conference Room A. I'm Marcus Thomson, CEO of Thomson Industries." He spoke clearly, enunciating each word, his posture straight but non-threatening. This was the Marcus I'd seen in countless business meetings, composed, professional, unflappable even under pressure. The manager stepped forward, his lips curved into what might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "Mr. Thomson, you say? I'm sorry, but we don't have anyone by that name on our guest list for today's meeting." His tone was patronizing, the kind of voice you'd use to address a child who was obviously lying about something. I felt my stomach drop. This was happening. In 2024, in downtown Chicago, in a hotel that prided itself on serving the city's business elite, this was actually happening. I could see David Hartwell looking confused, clearly wondering what was taking Marcus so long. The other Hartwell executives were checking their phones, probably assuming Marcus was running late due to traffic or some other mundane reason. "There must be some mistake," Marcus said, reaching for his briefcase. "I have the reservation confirmation right here, along with the meeting details and—" "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the conference room," the security guard interrupted, moving closer to Marcus. "If you don't have authorization to be here, you need to leave the premises immediately." The guard's hand moved closer to his radio, a subtle but clear threat that he was prepared to call for backup if necessary. Through the glass, I could see Marcus's jaw tighten slightly. I knew that look. It was the same expression I'd seen on his face during board meetings when investors questioned his strategies without having done their homework, when competitors tried to undercut his prices by using inferior materials, when the world seemed determined to prove he didn't belong in the spaces his success had earned him. "I'm not leaving," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a steel I'd only heard a few times before. "I have a $15 million deal to close in that room, and I'm not going anywhere until it's done." He gestured toward the conference room where the Hartwell team was waiting, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid giving the security guard any excuse for escalation. The manager actually laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that cut through the tension like a knife. $15 million? Sir, the people in that conference room are serious business executives from one of the largest corporations in America. They don't have time for whatever game you're playing here. His tone dripped with condescension, as if the very idea of Marcus belonging in that room was absurd. That's when something inside me snapped. I'd been watching this scene unfold through the glass doors, feeling the familiar burn of rage that came from witnessing injustice in real time. I'd experienced similar situations myself throughout my career. The law school professors who assumed I was there on affirmative action rather than merit, the opposing counsel who spoke to my white colleagues instead of me during depositions, the judges who seemed surprised when I demonstrated competence in their courtrooms. But watching it happen to Marcus was different. This wasn't about academic credentials or legal expertise that could be questioned or debated. This was about a man who had built something extraordinary from nothing, who had created jobs for hundreds of people, who had earned his place at the table through sheer force of will, intelligence, and determination. And still, none of that mattered to the people standing in front of him. I stood up from the conference table, my chair scraping against the marble floor loud enough to catch the attention of the Hartwell executives. "Excuse me for a moment," I said to David Hartwell, my voice carefully controlled but carrying an edge that made him look up from his phone with concern. I walked to the glass doors and opened them, stepping into the hallway where three white men were treating my business partner like he was some kind of threat to their carefully ordered world. The click of my heels on the marble floor seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet hallway. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned to project in courtrooms and boardrooms across the country. "Is there a problem here?" I kept my tone professional but let just enough steel show through to make it clear I wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. The manager turned to me and I saw the exact moment when his expression shifted. I was wearing a tailored black suit from Brooks Brothers, my hair pulled back in a professional bun, my Harvard Law School class ring clearly visible on my finger, and a Cartier watch that cost more than most people's cars. I looked like someone who belonged in their world, someone who could afford to be in their hotel, someone whose presence didn't need explanation or justification. "Ma'am, we're just dealing with a small security issue," he said, his tone completely different from the one he'd used with Marcus. His voice was respectful, almost deferential, the way you speak to someone you perceive as having power or influence. "Nothing for you to worry about." "This man," I said, gesturing to Marcus with a slight nod, "is Marcus Thompson, the CEO of Thompson Industries and my business partner. He's here to close a $15 million acquisition deal with Hartwell Corporation. The same meeting you're preventing him from attending." I kept my voice level but let each word land with the weight of a potential lawsuit. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the wheels turning in the manager's head, the dawning realization that he might have made a mistake. The security guard shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that the situation was escalating beyond his pay grade. Behind us, I could hear muffled voices from the conference room as the Hartwell executives began to notice the commotion in the hallway. But instead of backing down, instead of apologizing and trying to salvage the situation, the manager doubled down on his position. It was a decision that would prove to be one of the most expensive mistakes of his career. If he's really a CEO, then he should have no problem providing proper identification and documentation, the manager said, his voice taking on a defensive tone. "We have security protocols for a reason and they apply to everyone equally." "What protocols?" I asked, my attorney instincts kicking in. "Did you ask the Hartwell executives for identification when they arrived? Did you question their right to be here? Did you require them to provide documentation of their meeting?" The manager's face flushed red, a tell that any experienced lawyer would recognize as a sign of someone who knew they were on shaky ground. That's different." "How is it different?" I pressed, taking a step closer. "Please explain to me exactly how it's different." They're expected guests," he stammered, clearly realizing how weak his argument sounded even as he made it. "So is he," I replied flatly. "Mr. Thompson has a confirmed reservation for this meeting. His name is on the guest list. He's wearing appropriate business attire. He's conducting himself professionally. So please tell me what exactly makes him different from the other expected guests." The manager opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again without saying anything. The security guard was now looking everywhere except at the three of us, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. And that's when I realized that this wasn't just about mistaken identity or security protocols. This was about something much deeper and more troubling. The standoff continued for another 15 minutes. 15 minutes that felt like hours as hotel guests walked past, some stopping to stare at the scene unfolding in the hallway. 15 minutes during which I watched Marcus maintain his composure while being treated like he was some kind of criminal. 15 minutes during which I felt the familiar burn of rage that came from witnessing injustice in real time, but this time amplified by the knowledge that this was happening to someone I respected and cared about. During those 15 minutes, I observed something that crystallized everything I'd learned about racism in America. The manager wasn't just questioning Marcus's identity, he was questioning his right to exist in this space. Every time Marcus spoke, the manager's expression showed a mixture of disbelief and irritation, as if Marcus's very presence was an affront to the natural order of things. I'd seen this before, of course. I'd lived it myself in countless ways throughout my career. The law school professors who assumed I was there on affirmative action rather than merit, despite my perfect LSAT scores and undergraduate academic record. The opposing counsel who spoke to my white colleagues instead of me during depositions, even when I was clearly the lead attorney on the case. The judges seemed surprised when I demonstrated competence in their courtrooms, as if legal expertise was somehow unexpected from someone who looked like me. But watching it happen to Marcus was different in a way that cut deeper than my own experiences. This wasn't about academic credentials or legal expertise that could be questioned or debated. This was about a man who had built something extraordinary from nothing, who had created jobs for hundreds of people, who had earned his place at the table through sheer force of will, intelligence, and determination. And still, none of that mattered to the people standing in front of him. The cruel irony was that Marcus had spent years preparing for moments like this. He graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern with a degree in electrical engineering. He'd earned an MBA from Kellogg, where he'd been one of only 3 black students in his class. He'd worked at Boeing for 5 years, earning patents for innovative designs and building a reputation as one of their most promising young engineers. Every step of his journey had been calculated to ensure that when moments like this came, and we both knew they would come, he'd be so obviously qualified that even prejudice would have to acknowledge his right to be in the room. But qualification, we were learning, was irrelevant when the fundamental assumption was that you didn't belong. "You know what?" Marcus said finally, his voice still calm but carrying an edge I'd only heard a few times before. "I'm going to give you one more chance to step aside and let me into that conference room. After that, I'm going to make a phone call that's going to change how you think about customer service." The manager smirked, an expression that revealed just how little he understood about the situation he'd created. "Who are you going to call? Your lawyer?" He glanced at me with a look that suggested he thought I was probably just someone Marcus had hired to play a role in whatever con game he imagined was being run. "No," Marcus said, pulling out his phone with deliberate slowness. "I'm going to call David Hartwell directly and tell him that his business partner's hotel is preventing me from attending our meeting. Then I'm going to suggest we move the signing to my office instead." For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across the manager's face. The name David Hartwell clearly meant something to him, as it should have. Hartwell Corporation was one of the Grand Meridian's biggest corporate clients, booking hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of meetings, conferences, and events each year. "David Hartwell?" the manager asked, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "The CEO of Hartwell Corporation," Marcus confirmed. "The man who's been trying to acquire my company for the past 6 months. The man who's waiting for me in that conference room right now, probably wondering why his business partner is being treated like a criminal in the lobby of what's supposed to be Chicago's premier business hotel." I watched the manager's face go through several calculations as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. But even then, even with the possibility of losing a major corporate client staring him in the face, he couldn't quite bring himself to admit he'd been wrong. I suppose I could verify your identity," he said weakly, as if he was doing Marcus some kind of favor. "You suppose?" I interjected, my voice dripping with disdain. "You've spent the last 20 minutes treating a respected businessman like a criminal, questioning his right to be in a hotel where he has a confirmed reservation for a $15 million business meeting, and now you suppose you could verify his identity?" The manager's face went through several different shades of red and white. Behind him, the security guard was shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was developing. Other hotel staff members had begun to notice the commotion, and I could see them whispering among themselves, probably wondering what was happening and whether they should intervene. That's when the conference room door opened and David Hartwell himself stepped into the hallway. He was a tall man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that comes from decades of closing deals and making decisions that affect thousands of people. His expression was initially confused, but as he took in the scene, Marcus being blocked by a security guard while the hotel manager stood by defensively, his confusion quickly turned to something much colder. "Marcus?" he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "What's going on out here? We've been waiting for you." The manager's face went through several different shades of red and white in rapid succession. "Mr. Hartwell, there was a misunderstanding about." "A misunderstanding?" Hartwell's voice was sharp, cutting through the manager's attempt at explanation. "You mean you didn't recognize the CEO of the company I'm about to acquire? The man whose technology is going to revolutionize our renewable energy division." "Sir, I was just following security protocols," the manager started, but Hartwell cut him off with a gesture. "By harassing my business partner?" Hartwell turned to Marcus, his expression apologetic but also clearly angry about what he was witnessing. "I'm sorry about this, Marcus. This is completely unacceptable." Marcus nodded, his composure finally cracking slightly for the first time since the confrontation began. "It's not the first time, David. Unfortunately, it probably won't be the last." That simple statement hung in the air like a weight, carrying with it the accumulated experience of every successful black professional in America. Here was a man who had achieved everything the American dream promised: wealth, success, respect, recognition, and he was still being treated like he didn't belong in the spaces his achievements had earned him. The statement revealed something that I don't think the white people in that hallway had ever really considered. That success doesn't immunize you from racism, it just changes the venues where you experience it. Marcus could be worth millions of dollars, could employ hundreds of people, could hold patents worth tens of millions more, and still be questioned about whether he belonged in a hotel conference room. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Hartwell repeated, his voice rising slightly. "I want to speak to your general manager immediately." "I am the general manager," Morrison replied weakly. "Then I want to speak to your corporate headquarters," Hartwell continued. This kind of treatment is exactly the opposite of what Hartwell Corporation expects from our business partners. The threat was clear and immediate. The Grand Meridian Hotel didn't just host individual meetings for Hartwell Corporation. They had a multi-million-dollar annual contract that covered dozens of events, conferences, and executive retreats. Losing that contract would be a significant financial blow to the hotel. But what happened next was something I'll never forget, and it's the reason I'm telling this story today. Instead of simply accepting Hartwell's apology and walking into the conference room to pretend the incident hadn't happened, Marcus made a decision that changed everything. He could have taken the easy path, let the manager's behavior slide, focused on closing his deal, and moved on with his life. Most people would have done exactly that. But Marcus chose a different route, one that would have consequences far beyond that Tuesday morning in Chicago. "David," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made everyone in the hallway stop talking and listen. "I appreciate your apology, but I need to ask you something before we proceed with this meeting." Hartwell frowned, clearly surprised by the shift in Marcus's tone. "Of course. What is it? Are you comfortable conducting business in a hotel that treats people like this?" Marcus asked, gesturing slightly toward the manager and security guard. "Because if we're going to be partners, if Thompson Industries is going to be part of the Hartwell Corporation family, then I need to know that you share my values about how people should be treated." The question hung in the air like a challenge. I realized that Marcus wasn't just asking about this particular incident, he was asking whether Hartwell Corporation was the kind of company that would stand up for its principles when it was inconvenient, when it might cost them something. Hartwell looked around the hallway, taking in the scene with new eyes. The security guard was still standing at attention, ready to remove Marcus from the premises. The manager clearly hoped this would all blow over so he could get back to his normal routine. The other hotel staff pretend not to watch while obviously listening to every word. "No," Hartwell said finally, his voice carrying a finality that made the manager's face go completely white. "I'm not comfortable with this at all." I watched the manager finally understand what was happening. This wasn't just about a business meeting anymore. This was about the reputation of his hotel, the relationships that kept his doors open, the corporate contracts that paid his salary and determined his bonuses. "Mr. Thompson," the manager said quickly, desperation creeping into his voice. "I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. Please let me make this right." "How?" Marcus asked, the question simple but devastating. "How do you make this right? How do you undo the assumption that a black man in an expensive suit couldn't possibly be here for a legitimate business meeting? How do you take back the 20 minutes you spent treating me like I was some kind of threat to your precious hotel? The manager opened his mouth then closed it. He had no answer because there was no answer that could undo what had happened. The damage was done, the assumptions revealed, the bias laid bare for everyone to see. I'll tell you what, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. I'm going to give you a choice. You can either explain to your corporate headquarters why you lost a $15 million deal and one of your biggest corporate clients because you couldn't treat a black businessman with basic respect, or you can use this as a learning opportunity. A learning opportunity? The manager asked weakly, clearly grasping for any option that wouldn't result in his termination. Diversity training, Marcus said. For your entire staff. Real training, not some half-day workshop about not saying offensive things. I'm talking about unconscious bias education, cultural competency training, sessions about recognizing and confronting prejudice. The works. And you're going to implement it within the next 60 days. The manager nodded frantically. Yes, absolutely. Whatever you think is appropriate. We'll bring in the best consultants, spare no expense. And, Marcus continued, clearly not finished, you're going to make a donation to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. $50,000 in the name of the Grand Meridian Hotel, with a public statement about your commitment to fighting racial discrimination. $50,000. The manager started to protest, probably thinking about how he'd explain that expense to his corporate overlords, then caught himself when he saw the expression on Hartwell's face. Yes, of course. We'll make that donation immediately. But Marcus wasn't finished. I could see in his expression that he'd been thinking about this moment for longer than just the past 20 minutes. This was about every time he'd been followed in a store, every time his credentials had been questioned, every time someone had assumed he was the help rather than the CEO. And finally, Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years building something meaningful, you're going to personally apologize to every black employee in this hotel for creating and maintaining a culture where this kind of behavior is acceptable. You're going to look them in the eye and acknowledge that your leadership has failed them. The manager's face was now completely pale. Mr. Thompson, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, Marcus replied. You just have to do it. Because the alternative is explaining to your board of directors why you lost one of the biggest corporate contracts in the hotel's history over your inability to treat people with dignity. David Hartwell had been watching this exchange with growing admiration, and I could see something shifting in his expression. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about character, about values, about the kind of partner he wanted Hartwell Corporation to be associated with. You know what, Marcus? Hartwell said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I like your style. Maybe we should discuss more than just an acquisition. Maybe we should talk about a true partnership, with you maintaining operational control and joining our board of directors. And that's when I realized what Marcus had done. He hadn't just stood up for himself. He'd turned a moment of humiliation into a demonstration of leadership. He'd shown everyone in that hallway, including David Hartwell, exactly the kind of man he was and the kind of values he brought to his business. The security guard, who had been standing awkwardly throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke up. Mr. Thompson, I want to apologize too. I should have questioned what was happening here instead of just following orders. Marcus looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Thank you for saying that. That takes courage. What's your name? Hartwell asked the security guard. James Rodriguez, sir. Well, James, I think you just demonstrated the kind of integrity we look for in people. If you're ever interested in a career change, Hartwell Corporation is always looking for security professionals who can think for themselves. The offer was unexpected, but it demonstrated something important about the kind of leader Hartwell was. He wasn't just apologizing for the hotel's behavior. He was actively rewarding someone who'd shown the courage to acknowledge their mistake. The meeting that followed was unlike any business negotiation I'd ever witnessed in my 15 years of practice. Instead of the typical back and forth over price points and contract terms, David Hartwell spent most of the time asking Marcus about his experiences as a black entrepreneur in America. He wanted to understand the challenges, the obstacles, the daily indignities that successful black business owners faced. I've been in business for 40 years, Hartwell said as we settled into the conference room, and I've never had to think about what it's like to have my credentials questioned every time I walk into a room. Today was educational for me in ways I didn't expect. Marcus leaned back in his chair, seeming to consider how much to share. The thing is, David, I don't want special treatment. I just want equal treatment. I want to be judged by the same standards as everyone else, by my results, my character, my contribution to society. And you should be, Hartwell replied. In fact, I'd like to propose something. I want Thompson Industries to lead our new diversity and inclusion initiative. We're going to implement the same training program you suggested for the hotel across all of our properties and subsidiaries. That caught my attention immediately. Hartwell Corporation owned hotels, office buildings, and manufacturing facilities across 12 states. We were talking about potentially impacting thousands of employees and customers. What exactly are you proposing? I asked, my legal mind already running through the implications. A comprehensive partnership, Hartwell explained. Not just acquiring Thompson Industries, but making Marcus our Chief Diversity Officer and having Thompson Industries serve as our diversity and inclusion consultant for all Hartwell Corporation properties. We're talking about a $20 million partnership instead of a $15 million acquisition. The increase in value was significant, but more important was what it represented. This wasn't just about buying Marcus's technology anymore, it was about buying his expertise, his perspective, his commitment to creating change. There's something else, Hartwell continued. I want to establish a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing degrees in engineering and business. Marcus, I'd like you to help us design the program and serve on the selection committee. By the end of the meeting, we'd structured a deal that was far more comprehensive than anything we'd originally envisioned. Thompson Industries would maintain its identity and operational independence while becoming a wholly owned subsidiary of Hartwell Corporation. Marcus would join Hartwell's board of directors and serve as Chief Diversity Officer for the entire corporation. And we'd establish a $10 million scholarship fund to support minority students in STEM fields. But perhaps most importantly, we'd created a model for how corporate partnerships could address systemic inequality. Instead of just talking about diversity and inclusion, we were building it into the fundamental structure of how the companies would operate together. As we were signing the final documents, Hartwell's chief financial officer, a woman named Patricia Chin, made an observation that stuck with me. You know, she said, we've been trying to improve our diversity metrics for years, but we've always approached it as a problem to be solved rather than an opportunity to be embraced. Today changed how I think about that. The transformation in the room was remarkable. What had started as a standard business acquisition had become something much more meaningful. A partnership based not just on financial terms but on shared values and a commitment to creating positive change. As we left the hotel that day, the manager approached us one final time. He looked like a man who'd aged several years in the span of a few hours, and I could see genuine remorse in his expression. Mr. Thompson, he said, his voice much quieter than it had been in the hallway. I want you to know that I've already contacted our corporate headquarters about implementing the training program you suggested. I've also reached out to 3 different diversity and inclusion consulting firms to get proposals for comprehensive staff education. Marcus stopped and looked at him. The anger was gone from his expression, replaced by something that might have been pity. That's a good start, he said. But remember, this isn't just about training. This is about changing hearts and minds. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels welcome, where everyone's dignity is respected. The manager nodded solemnly. I understand, sir. And I promise you this will never happen again. Not on my watch. I hope not, Marcus replied. Because the next person you treat like this might not be as patient as I was. As we walked to our cars, I reflected on what I'd witnessed. This wasn't just about one incident of discrimination. It was about the daily reality of being black in America, even when you've achieved everything society says you should achieve. It was about the exhaustion of constantly having to prove your worth, the frustration of being judged by stereotypes rather than accomplishments. But it was also about something else. It was about the power of refusing to accept injustice, of turning moments of humiliation into opportunities for change. Marcus could have simply walked away from that confrontation. He could have let the manager's behavior slide, focused on closing his deal, and moved on with his life. Instead, he chose to stand up not just for himself, but for every black person who would walk into that hotel after him. 3 weeks later, I received a call from James Rodriguez, the security guard from that day. He'd taken David Hartwell up on his offer and was starting a new position as a security supervisor at Hartwell Corporation's headquarters. But that wasn't why he was calling. Ms. Richardson, he said, I wanted to thank you and Mr. Thompson for what happened that day. It made me realize that I'd been part of a system that was wrong, and it gave me the courage to do something about it. What do you mean? I asked. I started speaking up, he explained. When I see security staff treating people differently based on how they look, I intervene. I ask questions. I make sure people are being treated fairly. It's made a difference. That phone call reminded me of something important. Change doesn't just happen at the top. It happens when individual people decide to act differently, to challenge unfairness when they see it, to use whatever power they have to make things better. 6 months later, I was invited to speak at a conference for minority business owners in Atlanta. The theme was turning obstacles into opportunities, and I knew immediately that I wanted to tell Marcus's story. But as I prepared my presentation, I realized that the real lesson wasn't just about what Marcus had done, it was about what all of us can do when we refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. The Grand Meridian Hotel had become a model for inclusive hospitality practices. Their diversity training program was so successful that other hotels began requesting information about how to implement similar initiatives. The $50,000 donation to the NAACP had funded legal assistance for small business owners facing discrimination. And the personal apologies to Black staff members had led to the formation of an employee resource group that was helping to shape hotel policies. But perhaps most importantly, the story had spread throughout Chicago's business community. Other companies began examining their own practices, asking themselves whether they were creating environments where everyone could succeed. The ripple effects of that one moment of courage were still expanding months later. Thompson Industries had thrived under the partnership with Hartwell Corporation. We'd opened 2 new manufacturing facilities, created over 400 jobs, and were on track to become one of the largest minority-owned businesses in the Midwest. The scholarship fund had awarded its first grants to 12 students, young people who might not have had the opportunity to pursue engineering degrees without financial support. Marcus had become something of a celebrity in the business world, not because of his wealth or his technology, but because of his willingness to use his success as a platform for change. He'd spoken at conferences across the country, sharing his story and challenging other business leaders to examine their own assumptions about who belongs in their boardrooms and executive suites. But when I asked him how he felt about all the attention, his response was characteristically humble. The goal was never to become famous, he said. The goal was to make it easier for the next person who looks like me to walk into a room and be seen for who they are rather than what people assume about them. That's the lesson I shared with the audience in Atlanta, and it's the lesson I want to share with you today. The fight for equality isn't just about changing laws or policies, though those things matter. It's about changing hearts and minds, one conversation at a time, one confrontation at a time, one moment of courage at a time. Marcus Thompson taught me that dignity isn't something other people can take away from you, it's something you choose to maintain, even when the world seems determined to strip it away. He taught me that success isn't just about personal achievement, it's about using your platform to create opportunities for others. Most importantly, he taught me that the moments when we're most tempted to stay quiet, to avoid conflict, to take the easy path, are often the moments when our voices are most needed. The courage to speak up in that hotel hallway didn't just change the trajectory of a business deal, it changed the lives of countless people who would benefit from the policies and programs that resulted from that confrontation. Today, Thompson Industries is one of the most successful Black-owned businesses in America. The Grand Meridian Hotel has become a leader in inclusive hospitality practices. And David Hartwell has become one of the most vocal advocates for diversity in corporate America, using his platform to challenge other CEOs to examine their own company's practices. But the real victory isn't in the money or the recognition or the policy changes. The real victory is in the knowledge that the next Black entrepreneur who walks into that hotel will be greeted with respect instead of suspicion. The real victory is in the understanding that our struggles have meaning when they create paths for others to follow. The scholarship students we've supported are now in their second year of college, studying engineering and business and preparing to become the next generation of leaders. When they graduate, they'll enter a business world that's slightly more welcoming than the one Marcus and I encountered, and that's because people like Marcus chose to fight instead of walking away. Remember this, they can try to block your path but they cannot block your purpose. They can question your credentials but they cannot question your worth. They can doubt your abilities but they cannot diminish your potential. The only question is, when your moment comes, when you're faced with the choice between accepting injustice and standing up for what's right, what will you choose? Your answer will define not just your own future, but the future of everyone who comes after you. Make it count. Make it matter. Make it a moment that changes not just your own life, but the lives of people you'll never meet in ways you might never know. Because that's how change really happens in America. Not through grand gestures or sweeping proclamations, but through individual acts of courage by people who refuse to accept that this is just how things are. Marcus Thompson refused to accept it. And because he did, thousands of people are living in a slightly more just world today. The question is, what will you refuse to accept?